The United States is about to begin a downward spiral that, if they don't stop, is going to end in national ruin. And unfortunately, there are relatively few that realize it. I'm talking about several things. I'm talking about the calls among Christian nationalists for a national day of rest. I'm talking about President Trump's declaration and call for all Americans to rest on the Sabbath. Unfortunately, people don't realize that for the entire recorded history of humanity, every time there is a state-sanctioned religion, it always ends in persecution. And yet, many are about to embark on the exact same path. And today, I'm going to prove that to you by taking you through a short journey, showing you the history of religious persecution when religion and state combine. And hopefully, someone watching this won't be so indifferent to what's happening in the United States. Today, we're going to take a look at a well-known prophecy, but we're going to look at it in a different way, through a different lens. We're going to look at it through the lens of religious persecution, and it will help you to understand where these things are headed. And for most of you, I promise, you will see a perspective that you may not have seen before. This prophecy not only discusses 5 kingdoms, but by default, it also covers 5 periods of time in which God's people would be persecuted by religious and governmental powers. In Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, received a dream of an image made of metal in which God showed him the entire history of humanity from his day to the end of time. The image shown to him was like a living parable to explain world history. It was an image made up of gold, silver, bronze, iron and clay. And then finally, a great stone at the end destroys this image, representing the second coming of Christ and the establishment of the everlasting kingdom. Each of these 5 periods or kingdoms had periods of forced religious worship. And by forced worship, I mean that each kingdom required a form of worship that violated one of the first 4 commandments, which are the commandments dealing with the worship of God. And please don't miss this, because this will help you to understand what we can expect to happen in the United States and then around the world. There is going to be forced worship dealing with one of the first 4 commandments, and you'll see that in just a moment. But back to the dream. The interpretation of the dream was given to Nebuchadnezzar by the prophet Daniel, and he was told that each part of this image represented a kingdom or a period of time in human history. And please pay close attention, because this prophecy provides us with the framework on which all, and I mean all, end-time prophecy is based. The framework is not preterism. The framework is not futurism. The framework is historicism, as history unfolds over time. Babylon was represented by the head of gold, the Medo-Persian Empire by the chest and arms of silver, the Greek Empire by the thighs of bronze, the pagan Roman Empire by the iron, and the papal Roman Empire represented by the feet of iron and clay. But here's the thing. The feet of iron and clay means so much more because of something else from the vision. In the vision, we see a stone representing God's kingdom, hitting the image and grinding it to pieces. This means that at the end of time, the feet of iron and clay are still in existence. So here's what we need to understand. The iron represents the state, and the clay represents God's people, or the church. We know this because in Jeremiah 18, verse 6, it says that God is the potter, and the children of Israel were the clay. So if the potter represents Israel, then why am I saying that it represents the church? That's because in the New Testament, the Christian church saw themselves as spiritual Israel. This is why Paul said that those who accept Christ are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. This is why the Apostle James wrote in his letter to the 12 tribes scattered throughout the world, even though the literal 12 tribes of Israel were no longer in existence. They understood that they were spiritual Israel. This is how we know that at the end of time, there's going to be this mingling of church and state that began after the Roman Empire and continues until the end of time. With that being settled, let's look at how the history of religious persecution has unfolded throughout history and how it will return again in the future. We'll start with the recorded religious persecution that took place in the Babylonian Empire. We find a record of this in Daniel chapter 3, where Nebuchadnezzar builds an image of solid gold. As a matter of fact, it probably looks similar to the solid gold image of President Trump at Mar-a-Lago, the one where Christians went to a similar type of dedication. Now, I'm not saying that this is specifically prophetic, but it sure is interesting and eerie to say the least. Anyway, Nebuchadnezzar made a proclamation or a decree that when music was played, everyone was required to bow down and worship, and whoever did not would be thrown into a furnace of fire. Nebuchadnezzar was seeking to maintain the glory of his empire, and he thought that he could do this by forcing people to worship him. As the history goes, there were only 3 that did not go along, and they were indeed thrown into the fire to be killed. However, God delivered them from this and spared their lives, showing God's disdain of forced worship. In this instance, the boys were pressured into breaking the first 2 commandments: "Thou shalt not have any other gods before me," and that we are not to worship any graven image. Let's read it to get the full picture. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and fury, gave the command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the gold image which I have set up? Now, if you are ready, at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, psaltery, in symphony, with all kinds of music, and you fall down and worship the image which I have made, good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands?" You see, they were pressured to break the first 2 commandments. And you're going to see this pattern of forced worship with every single period of history. Now fast forward to kingdom number 2, Medo-Persia, represented by silver. This kingdom tried to get the entire nation to worship by requiring everyone to only worship the king for 30 days. After all, it was just a short amount of time. Then everyone could go back to worshiping how they wanted. But once again, there was a minority that would not. And the minority was Daniel, who understood the first commandment, that he could have no other God before God. And as a result, he was thrown into a lion's den. Once again, God preserved the faithful and preserved his life, once again showing that God does not support forced worship. It says, "So these governors and satraps thronged before the king and said thus to him, 'King Darius, live forever. All the governors of the kingdom, the administrators and satraps, the counselors and advisors, have consulted together to establish a royal decree and to make a firm decree that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing so that it cannot be changed, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which does not alter.' Therefore, King Darius signed the written decree." Once again, forced worship against one of God's commandments. And this story is going to repeat itself. Next up was the Greek Empire, started by Alexander the Great. The persecution of God's people is not recorded in Scripture. However, the persecution that took place under the emperor Antiochus Epiphanes is recorded in the historical book of Maccabees, which outlines exactly what took place. And by the way, before I read this, I have to say this. Antiochus Epiphanes is not the little horn of Daniel 7 or 8. In a moment, you'll see exactly who that horn is. But the persecution during the Greek Empire looked like this. "Then the king wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people, and that each should give up his customs. All the Gentiles accepted the command of the king. Many, even from Israel, gladly adopted his religion. They sacrificed to idols and profaned the Sabbath. And the king sent letters by messengers to Jerusalem and the cities of Judah. He directed them to follow customs strange to the land, to forbid burnt offerings and sacrifices and drink offerings in the sanctuary, to profane Sabbaths and feasts, to defile the sanctuary and the priests, to build altars and sacred precincts and shrines for idols, to sacrifice swine and unclean animals, and to leave their sons uncircumcised. They were to make themselves abominable by everything unclean and profane, so that they should forget the law and change all the ordinances. And whoever does not obey the command of the king shall die." Here we find that Antiochus wanted the Jews to break all 4 of the commandments dealing with the worship of God: having a God before God, burning incense to an idol, blaspheming by sacrificing unclean animals, and that they should not keep the Sabbath. Once again, threatening them with death. I hope you're seeing the pattern here. 3 nations so far, all part of Daniel's initial vision, and each of them tried to get God's people to go against one or some of his commandments. Next up was the Roman Empire, represented by the legs of iron. This empire initially allowed people to practice the religion of their choice, having a somewhat passive posture towards the various religions. However, by the time we get to the 3rd century AD, something drastic happened. The Roman Empire was dealing with famine and disease. The empire was in decline, and the emperors began to believe that the nation needed to get back to their gods in order to secure the prosperity of the empire. One of the main emperors to do this was Emperor Decius. This was a pivotal moment in history because it was the first time a Roman emperor mandated a universal empire-wide religious act. Based on historical accounts, such as those from Saint Cyprian and Bishop Dionysius, and also recorded in the surviving certificates for those that went along with forced worship, the Edict of Decius mandated the following universal compliance. Every inhabitant of the empire, men, women, and children, was required to perform a religious act by a specific deadline. To be considered loyal, a person had to do 3 things. 1. Sacrifice. Offer an animal or a grain offering to the Roman gods. Number 2. Libation. Pour a drink offering, usually wine, in honor of the gods. And number 3. Taste. Eat a portion of the sacrificial meat to prove participation. The act was officially done for the, quote, safety of the empire, as Decius believed that the gods were angry and causing the plagues and wars that were then threatening Rome. The penalty? Those who refused to comply were not allowed to participate in society and were subject to arrest, trial, and execution. As a matter of fact, here is a copy of an actual certificate that was given to someone who complied with the demand to break the 1st commandment to have no other gods before God, and the 2nd commandment to worship idols. And it has some very specific information that I want you to notice. It had the person's location, lineage, age, and something that identified them. Take a look. To the commissioners of sacrifices of the village of Alexander's Island, from Aurelius Diogenes of the village of Alexander's Island, aged 72 years old, scar on his right eyebrow. I have always sacrificed regularly to the gods, and now in your presence, in accordance with the edict, I have offered sacrifice and poured a drink offering and tasted of the sacrifices, and I request you to certify the same. Farewell. Handed in by me, Aurelius Diogenes. I, Aurelius Cyrus, certify that I saw him sacrificing. Even though they did not have the technology that exists today, it is clear that they used what was available to identify who was who and who complied, and those who did not comply were met with severe consequences. You see, if they complied with the edict, they were permitted to continue taking part in society. If they did not comply with the edict, as we have already seen, they were subject to arrest, trial, and execution. And by the way, to all the preterists out there, this is not the fulfillment of Revelation 13, as Revelation 13 involves forced worship for the entire world, the entire planet, and the forced worship that we just looked at only took place within the context of the Roman Empire. The persecution took place regarding the breaking of one of the first 4 commandments related to the worship of Jehovah. Once again, there was a threat of death. Please keep this in mind, because if you're a Christian, this is where things get close to home, because now we come to the 5th kingdom, which was really just an extension of the 4th kingdom, which was pagan Rome. But instead of pagan Rome, something new emerged. This was something called papal Rome. Same territory, same government, but this time something different happened. This something was referred to in Daniel 7 as a beast that was diverse or different from all the other kingdoms before it. This time it was God's people, Christians who were now coming together with the government to enforce their doctrines, and Christianity was declared to be the official religion of the empire or the government. This is exactly what is happening today, especially at this moment in time where America is being rededicated to God. While I'm a Christian, I do not like where this is heading, and you're going to see why as we look at this ancient union of church and state that took place during the Dark Ages. With the Edict of Thessalonica in 380 AD, Christianity officially became the state religion of the Roman Empire. This was issued by Emperor Theodosius, and around 15 years before that edict, the church was emboldened to declare that anyone that was found Judaizing by keeping the Sabbath was to be excommunicated from the church. And here's the thing, that excommunication wasn't just a casual policy. It was made official at the Council of Laodicea around 364 AD, where the church declared in Canon 29 that Christians shall not Judaize and be idle on the Sabbath, but shall work on that day. And anyone who kept the seventh-day Sabbath would be anathema from Christ. Anathema, cursed, cut off. I don't want you to miss this. Since Christianity was the state religion, this also meant that the state would often intervene in matters of faith, with the church using the power of the state to enforce their religion, like when Constantine provided benefits for the Christian church, like giving Christians special treatment when it came to taxes. This continued for centuries and was cemented with the act of Emperor Charlemagne around 800 AD, when he made Sabbath observance mandatory. The state religion had now made it a punishable offense to obey the fourth commandment as God had wrote it. Is it possible that this is going to happen again? Is it possible that Sabbath keepers will eventually be looked at with the same contempt? We'll answer that in just a moment. But what we saw with the papal Roman Empire is exactly what the Bible prophesied in Daniel chapter 7. It said that there would be a power that would emerge, that would think to change times and laws, and that this power would wear out or persecute the saints of God. Charlemagne believed that for his empire to prosper, it needed the favor of God. He viewed Sunday rest not just as a religious suggestion, but as a civil law necessary to ensure uniformity. He wanted to make sure that every person in the empire was living under the same Christian standard. But here we have persecution in the fifth period, the iron and clay period that saw Christians forced to break the fourth commandment by the church and the empire. This is what most Christians today fail to understand, because they believe that the Sabbath was changed from Saturday to Sunday by the church in the first and second centuries, and that everyone just accepted it. But not so. The change from Sabbath to Sunday was a gradual process that took place with suggestions, then threats of being kicked out of the church, and then finally from church and state coming together and threatening those who did not comply. This was the papal Roman Empire. The prophecies of Daniel 7, Daniel 11, and Revelation 13 all declare that this empire would last for 1,260 years, and this is exactly what happened. From 538 AD to 1798 AD, the Bishop of Rome, also known as the Pope, was seen as the state-sanctioned leader of the Roman and then the Holy Roman Empire. And this came to an end, as I said, in 1798. That's when Napoleon's General Berthier took the Pope prisoner. The ability to even do this was a direct result of the French Revolution that established the principle of political atheism, also known as the separation of church and state. This was new. This was unique. And as a Christian, I believe in this principle that while God and religion are free for politicians to accept and express their faith, they should absolutely never try to suggest through legislative decrees or proclamations that others be compelled to live out that faith, whether they're promoting a true Sabbath or a false Sabbath, or dedicating a country to the true God or a false God. Unfortunately, many Christians are trying to apply the exact same framework today that took place in the papal Roman Empire, especially as it relates to the motives we saw coming from Charlemagne, the first emperor of the so-called Holy Roman Empire, crowned by the Pope. You have Christian leaders who feel the need to rededicate the nation to God, to fix the moral issues around us, which is why what we are seeing take place in the United States regarding the rededication of America to God is so troubling. The 250-year celebration should have been a celebration of freedom based on what the writers of the Constitution understood to be the need to prevent a national religion or a national God. This is exactly what the founding fathers were attempting to avoid at all costs because they understood the results of a nation that chooses a de facto religion. And it's not like I'm putting words in their mouths. James Madison, the man who actually wrote the First Amendment, said it like this: "The religion then of every man must be left to the conviction and conscience of every man, and it is the right of every man to exercise it as these may dictate." Jefferson called it a wall of separation between church and state. These weren't atheists or agnostics trying to push God out of the public square. Many of these men were Christians who had read enough history to know what happens when the state starts dictating worship. They read about Babylon. They read about Medo-Persia and Greece. They read about Decius. They read about Charlemagne. And they built a constitution specifically to prevent the United States from becoming the next chapter in the history book of religious persecution. Whether you understand it or not, what has existed in the United States for the past 250 years is very unique when compared against the backdrop of human history. The beauty of America is that it kept religion out of politics. As we've seen in the history of religious persecution, any time a nation has a national religion, whether pagan or Christian or Muslim or anything else, they will always come to the place where they persecute those who do not go along with the state-sanctioned religion. This 250-year gap without a state-sanctioned religion is eroding away right before our eyes, as millions of Americans are celebrating by trying to implement a government-supported religion. Even if it's the religion that I believe in, I do not and will never support these movements because I know where it's going to lead. And it's going to lead to the church, much like Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, pagan Rome, and papal Rome, trying to force people to break one of God's commandments. And I believe it will be the fourth commandment, the seventh-day Sabbath. I'm not saying it's happening right now at this very moment, but I am saying that there are Christians that absolutely want to compel people to worship on a day that God did not ordain, and they are gaining more and more political power. As I already mentioned, Revelation 13, along with Daniel 11, 7, and 2, all state the same thing. There was a union of church and state, represented by the iron and clay, the little horn of Daniel 7 and 8, the king of the north from Daniel 11, and the beast from the sea in Revelation 13. All of these point to the church-state power that would persecute God's people if they did not go along with the breaking of one or many of his commandments. Revelation 13 reveals that the power and the movements of that beast would be repeated at the end of time with the formation of the image to the beast and the enforcement of that beast's mark, which is the Sunday Sabbath. As a matter of fact, the very church that morphed into the Roman Catholic Church states proudly that the change of the Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday is a mark of their authority. The image to the beast is nothing more than a repetition of what took place during the Dark Ages. It's nothing more than the abandonment of the principles of the Constitution to keep religion out of the government. And we are seeing this live and in action right before our eyes. In the book Testimonies, page 451, it says that the United States would repudiate every principle of its Constitution as a Protestant and Republican government. That word repudiate means to refuse to accept or to be associated with, to deny the truth or validity of, or when it comes to the law, it means to refuse to fulfill or discharge. The principles of the Constitution only have to be repudiated or denied, and many are doing that today. The politicians only need to refuse to discharge their duties and protect the amendment that states that no law should be passed that establishes one religion over another. As I covered in the last video, the can of worms has already been opened with the president calling for a national day of rest. The prophecies outlined in Scripture are coming to pass. The union of iron and clay is once again being established. The image to the beast continues to form, and interestingly enough, millions either support it or don't even care. The history is clear. It tells us where this is headed. Despite this reality, some still say that this is much ado about nothing. Some say that this is a good thing, and we need the politicians to help bring the country back to God. And to that I say, God doesn't need the help of politicians. He never has, and he never will. So for those who say that what we're seeing is much ado about nothing, I say to you, when it comes to the calls to dedicate the nation to God, no, it's not forced yet. No, it's not the mark of the beast being enforced yet. It's not nothing. It's also not everything. But please, let me tell you, prophecy is being fulfilled, and it sure is something. God bless.